There is a place inside the human soul where all feeling goes to die, not dramatically, not violently, but quietly, like snow falling on abandoned streets, covering everything in a blanket of perfect, terrible silence. Imagine, if you will, standing at the edge of an infinite frozen lake. The surface is so smooth, so flawless, that you cannot tell where the ice ends and the sky begins. No wind disturbs it. No sound breaks its silence. You stand there, looking down at your reflection, and you realize something horrifying. You cannot remember the last time you felt your own heartbeat. This is not a metaphor. This is the lived reality of millions of human beings walking through the world right now. Their faces composed, their routines intact, their words appropriate, while inside, in the cathedral of their consciousness, every candle has gone out. They call it many things: dissociation, depersonalization, emotional blunting, anhedonia, alexithymia. The clinicians have their vocabularies, their diagnostic criteria, their neat little boxes to contain the uncanny experience of becoming a stranger to your own existence. But what we are exploring tonight goes deeper than diagnosis. We are entering the territory where psychology meets philosophy, where neuroscience encounters ancient wisdom, where the question, "Why can't I feel?" transforms into something far more unsettling. What if the inability to feel is not a dysfunction, but a message? What if numbness is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something else, something the conscious mind cannot yet comprehend? Consider this. You are watching a sunset that once moved you to tears. The same colors, the same light, the same sky, but now as you stand before it, you feel nothing. Not sadness, not joy, just a peculiar emptiness, as if someone has removed your emotional organs while you slept, leaving only the mechanical functions, breath, heartbeat, thought, operating on autopilot. You search for the feeling. You try to remember what awe felt like, what beauty tasted like on your consciousness. But it's like trying to remember a dream that dissolved the moment you woke. You know it was there once. You have evidence, memories of tears, of laughter, of that electric aliveness that used to course through your veins. But now? Now you are a museum of your former self, wandering through halls of artifacts you no longer recognize. This is the paradox we must confront. Emotional numbness is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of a protection so profound, so totalizing, that it transforms the very structure of consciousness itself. It is the mind's final defense against a world that has become too much, too painful, too chaotic, too real. And the price of that defense is the temporary death of the self. But here is what the textbooks will not tell you, what the therapists often miss, what even you, trapped in the frozen lake of your own psyche, may not yet understand. Numbness is not your enemy. It is a messenger from the depths, carrying intelligence about what your conscious mind cannot yet face. It is the emergency brake that prevents total psychological collapse. It is the cocoon before the transformation. It is the death that must precede awakening. Tonight, we embark on a journey into this mysterious terrain. We will trace the origins of emotional numbness through evolutionary biology, neuroscience, depth psychology, and ancient philosophical wisdom. We will descend into the personal and collective experiences of emotional shutdown, the trauma that freezes us, the modern world that numbs us, the existential terror that makes feeling unbearable. But we will not stop there. We will push through to the other side, where numbness reveals itself not as an endpoint, but as a threshold, where the frozen lake begins to crack, where feeling returns not as it was before, innocent, unguarded, vulnerable, but transformed into something wiser, stronger, more aligned with the truth of existence. This is Season 2 of our exploration, the awakening through collapse, through pain, through the death of who we thought we were. And emotional numbness? It is the portal. The question is, are you willing to pass through? Because understanding emotional numbness requires something more than intellectual curiosity. It requires the courage to look directly at the mechanism by which consciousness protects itself from reality, and the wisdom to recognize that this protection, while necessary, was never meant to be permanent. You are not broken because you cannot feel. You are transformed, mid-metamorphosis, caught in the liminal space between who you were and who you are becoming. The numbness is the chrysalis, and somewhere, deep in the frozen silence of your psyche, something is preparing to emerge. So let us begin at the beginning, at the evolutionary origins of this strange psychological defense, at the moment in deep time when the capacity to shut down feeling first emerged as a survival strategy. Let us understand how the brain learns to freeze, why consciousness sometimes chooses silence over sensation, and what ancient wisdom knew about the necessity of descent before rebirth. Let us enter the frozen cathedral together. Let us discover what waits in the silence between heartbeats, the evolutionary blueprint of freezing. Long before humans built cities or wrote philosophies or named their emotions, there was the predator and the prey, the hunter and the hunted, the perpetual dance of survival that shaped every circuit in our nervous system. Picture the ancient savannah. A gazelle, grazing peacefully, suddenly catches the scent of a lion on the wind. In that microsecond, before thought, before decision, before any conscious awareness, her nervous system makes a calculation. Fight, flight, or freeze? This is where our story begins, not in the therapist's office, not in the modern urban landscape of anxiety and disconnection, but in the primordial nervous system that we still carry within us, ancient and uncompromising, designed not for happiness, but for survival. The Polyvagal theory, developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges, reveals that we possess not one, but three distinct neural circuits for responding to threat, and the most ancient, the most primitive, is the dorsal vagal system. When activated, it doesn't prepare us to fight or flee. It shuts us down. It numbs us. It induces a state of immobilization, of collapsed energy, of emotional and even physical shutdown. Why would evolution design such a response? Because sometimes the best chance of survival is to become nothing, to disappear not by running, but by ceasing to register as alive, to shut down all non-essential systems, emotion, desire, connection, even pain, and conserve whatever energy remains for the possibility of eventual escape. The gazelle overtaken by the lion goes limp. Her eyes glaze. She appears dead. And sometimes, just sometimes, the predator loses interest. The pressure releases, and she springs back to life, running for safety. But here is the tragedy that echoes through millennia into the modern human psyche. What happens when the threat never ends? What happens when the predator is not a lion, but an abusive parent, a hostile society, an existential terror that permeates every day of existence? What happens when the nervous system activates this ancient shutdown response and then cannot deactivate it? The gazelle becomes permanently frozen. The human being becomes emotionally numb. This is not a metaphor. This is neurobiology. This is the literal architecture of dissociation, encoded in the oldest parts of your brainstem, beneath conscious control, beneath rational intervention. When we speak of emotional numbness, we are speaking of a survival mechanism so ancient, so deeply embedded, that it predates language, predates culture, predates everything we think of as distinctly human. You did not choose to feel nothing. Your nervous system chose for you, and it made that choice because, at some point, feeling everything was going to kill you. The neurological landscape of shutdown. Now let us move from evolutionary time into the intricate landscape of the human brain, that 3-pound universe where emotion is manufactured, memory is encoded, and the self constructs its fragile sense of continuity. The limbic system, sometimes called the emotional brain, sits at the center of this universe. The amygdala, that almond-shaped cluster of neurons, acts as your threat detector, constantly scanning the environment for danger. When it perceives threat, it sends emergency signals throughout the body. Heart rate increases, muscles tense, stress hormones flood the bloodstream. This is fear. This is anger. This is the raw, unfiltered experience of emotional aliveness. But there is another player in this system, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, planning, and executive function. In healthy circumstances, these two systems work in balance. Emotion provides the signal, reason provides the interpretation, and together they guide adaptive behavior. But what happens when the amygdala is overwhelmed? When the emotional signal is not a manageable warning, but a tsunami of terror, of pain, of unbearable overwhelm? The prefrontal cortex, in an act of protective dominance, can essentially disconnect from the limbic system. It can sever the communication between feeling and awareness. It can create what neurologists call dampened affect or emotional blunting, a state in which emotions continue to occur at the physiological level, but they are prevented from reaching conscious experience. Imagine a television with the volume turned all the way down. The show is still playing, the actors are still emoting, the drama is still unfolding, but you cannot hear it. All you see is silent movement, disconnected from its meaning, from its impact. This is emotional numbness at the neurological level, but it gets stranger, more mysterious, more philosophically profound. Recent neuroscience reveals that emotional numbness doesn't just dampen feeling, it actually alters the structure of consciousness itself. fMRI studies show that individuals experiencing chronic dissociation and emotional numbness display reduced connectivity between brain regions associated with self-awareness, emotional processing, and bodily sensation. In other words, numbness doesn't just block emotions, it begins to dissolve the very sense of self that experiences emotions in the first place. You don't just stop feeling. You begin to forget what it feels like to be someone who feels. The philosophers of nothingness. But this phenomenon, this strange erasure of felt experience, is not merely neurological. It is existential. It is philosophical. And humanity has been grappling with it for as long as we have been conscious enough to reflect on consciousness itself. Consider the ancient Buddhist concept of shunyata, often translated as emptiness or voidness. The Buddhist practitioners did not view emptiness as a pathology, but as a profound truth about the nature of existence. They taught that all phenomena, including the self, are empty of inherent, independent existence. To experience this emptiness directly was considered enlightenment. But there is a crucial distinction here, one that will become essential as our journey progresses. The Buddhist emptiness is reached through awareness, through meditation, through the deliberate cultivation of non-attachment. It is a chosen transcendence of the ego's insistence on solidity, permanence, and separate selfhood. Emotional numbness, by contrast, is not chosen. It is forced upon consciousness by circumstances too overwhelming to integrate. It is not the peaceful emptiness of enlightenment, but the desperate emptiness of dissociation. And yet, what if these two experiences, spiritual emptiness and psychological numbness, share a common gateway? What if both represent the ego's encounter with its own constructed nature? What if the frozen lake and the void are different faces of the same fundamental truth about consciousness? The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, staring into what he called the abyss, wrote, "When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." Emotional numbness is the abyss gazing back. It is the moment when consciousness looks at itself and finds nothing, no solid self, no permanent identity, no inherent meaning, just the construction, the performance, the elaborate illusion of continuity that we call I. For most people, this recognition is unbearable. The defense mechanisms activate. Numbness descends like an anesthetic. The abyss is concealed. But for some, for those who can bear to keep looking, this moment becomes the beginning of a profound transformation. The psychologist Carl Jung spent his life exploring what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological substrate beneath individual consciousness. He believed that within this unconscious realm dwelled archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that shape our dreams, our myths, our psychological development. One such archetype is the shadow, the repository of everything we reject, deny, or refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. The shadow contains not just our rage and our lust and our greed, but also our grief, our fear, our vulnerability, our shame. And here is the crucial insight. Emotional numbness is what happens when the shadow grows too large, too powerful, too dangerous to be held in conscious awareness. The psyche, unable to integrate the overwhelming content of the unconscious, simply shuts down the channel of communication. You become numb, not because you have no feelings, but because you have too many. Feelings so intense, so contradictory, so threatening to your sense of self that consciousness can only protect itself through total shutdown. The frozen lake is not empty. Beneath the ice, an entire ocean churns. The trauma that cannot be spoken. Now we must turn to the most difficult origin point of emotional numbness, trauma. Not the single traumatic incident, though those certainly can induce numbness, but the slow, grinding, developmental trauma of growing up in an environment where feelings are dangerous, where emotions are punished, where the authentic self must be hidden to survive. The psychologist Donald Winnicott introduced the concept of the false self, a protective persona that develops when a child's true emotional expression is consistently rejected, ignored, or met with hostility. The child learns to perform whatever version of themselves gains approval, while the authentic self, with its messy feelings, its vulnerable needs, its raw aliveness, goes into hiding. Where does it hide? Behind the numbness. Picture a child whose parent becomes enraged at any display of sadness. Stop crying, or I'll give you something to cry about. The child learns that sadness is dangerous, that vulnerability invites attack, that the only safe emotional state is a kind of blank neutrality. Or picture a child whose parent is chronically depressed, emotionally unavailable, lost in their own suffering. The child learns that their feelings are irrelevant, that emotional expression is futile, that the only way to maintain the connection with the parent is to become a mirror, empty, receptive, devoid of need. Or picture a child in a family where emotions are dramatic, explosive, overwhelming, where every day is a crisis, where the emotional volume is turned up so high that the only way to survive is to turn the inner volume completely down. In each case, the child's developing nervous system makes a calculation. Feeling is dangerous, expression is punished. Safety requires emotional shutdown, and so the numbness begins, not as a choice, not as a moral failing, but as an intelligent adaptation to an impossible situation. The tragedy is that this adaptation, while necessary for survival in childhood, becomes a prison in adulthood. The threat may have ended. The abusive parent may be gone, the overwhelming environment may have changed, but the nervous system, trained in shutdown, continues to respond to life with the same protective numbness. You carry the frozen lake within you, and you cannot remember how to thaw. The psychotherapist Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's leading trauma researchers, has documented how severe trauma literally changes brain structure. The hippocampus, responsible for memory formation, can shrink. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, can show reduced activity. And the connection between the reasoning brain and the emotional brain can become significantly impaired. But perhaps his most striking finding is this: trauma survivors often cannot identify what they're feeling. They experience physical sensations, a racing heart, a clenched stomach, and trembling hands, but they cannot connect these sensations to emotions. They cannot name what is happening inside them. This is called alexithymia, literally, no words for feelings. And it reveals something profound about the relationship between language, consciousness, and emotion. We do not simply experience feelings, we construct them through a complex process of bodily sensation, cognitive interpretation, and linguistic labeling. When trauma disrupts this process, when it severs the connection between body and mind, we are left with a strange half-experience. Something is happening, but we cannot say what. We are moved, but we cannot name by what. We are in pain, But the pain has no location, no cause, no story. This is numbness at its most insidious, not the absence of feeling, but the inability to recognize feeling when it occurs. You are experiencing emotions all the time. You just cannot feel yourself experiencing them. The modern architecture of disconnection. But we must also acknowledge that emotional numbness is not solely a product of individual trauma or neurological dysfunction. It is increasingly a collective phenomenon, a response to the unique conditions of modern existence. Consider the world you inhabit right now in this historical moment. You are exposed to more information in a single day than a medieval peasant encountered in a lifetime. You witness atrocities in real time, wars, climate disasters, injustices, streaming across your screen with the same casual presence as advertisements and celebrity gossip. You are expected to be constantly productive, constantly available, constantly optimizing yourself for an economic system that views you as a resource to be extracted. Your attention is fragmented across dozens of platforms, apps, and interruptions. Your relationships often exist in digital form, likes, comments, messages, stripped of the full-bodied presence that creates genuine intimacy. You are algorithmically sorted, targeted, and manipulated by systems designed to bypass your rational mind and trigger your most primitive impulses. And through it all, you are supposed to feel what? Gratitude? Enthusiasm? Passionate engagement? Is it any wonder that numbness has become the default state of modern consciousness? The philosopher Byung-Chul Han argues that we live in a burnout society, a culture characterized not by oppression from external authorities, but by self-exploitation driven by the internalized demand for constant achievement. We are, he suggests, depressed and burned out, not because we work too hard, but because we have lost the capacity for contemplation, for rest, for meaningful engagement with reality. Emotional numbness, in this context, is not individual pathology, but collective symptom. It is the psyche's response to a world that demands too much and provides too little genuine nourishment for the soul. You are numb because the world is too much, and also because it is not enough. The psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, writing in the mid-20th century, predicted this development. He saw that modern capitalism was creating a new kind of human being, the marketing character, who experiences themselves as a commodity to be sold, who measures their worth by external validation, who has lost touch with any authentic sense of being. What Fromm called alienation, we now call dissociation. What he called the fear of freedom, we now call emotional numbness. The terms change, but the experience remains. The feeling of being a stranger in your own life, of watching yourself from a distance, of performing the rituals of existence without any felt sense of meaning or purpose. This is not depression, though numbness and depression often travel together. This is something colder, more disorienting, more existentially disturbing, the sense that you are real, but not real enough, that you exist, but not fully, that you are alive, but not quite living. And here is the terrible irony. In seeking to protect ourselves from pain, from overwhelm, from the unbearable intensity of feeling everything, we have created a world that increasingly denies us the opportunity to feel anything at all. The frozen lake expands, the numbness spreads, and we wonder why we feel so alone. The moment of recognition. There comes a moment, perhaps sudden, perhaps gradual, when you realize that something fundamental has changed. You are in a conversation with someone you love, and they are telling you something important, something that should move you, should touch you, should elicit some response, and you feel nothing. You see their face, you hear their words, you understand the meaning, but there is no emotional resonance. It's as if you're watching through glass, or you are holding your child, this being who should flood you with overwhelming love and tenderness, and instead you feel empty, not hostile, not resentful, just absent. You go through the motions, the hug, the reassuring words, the appropriate smile, but inside, where the warm glow of connection should be, there is only vacancy. Or you wake up on a Saturday morning with nothing scheduled, no obligations, no demands, and instead of relief or pleasure or even boredom, you feel a kind of existential flatness, as if the world has been drained of color, of significance, of any reason to move or act or engage. This is the moment of recognition. This is when you realize, I am not okay. And more disturbing, I do not know how long I have not been okay. The psychologist Rollo May, one of the founders of existential psychology, described this experience as the loss of being. He argued that anxiety and numbness are two sides of the same coin. Anxiety arises when we feel too much of existence's inherent groundlessness. Numbness arises when we can no longer bear that feeling and shut down entirely. Both are responses to what he called the existential vacuum, the absence of inherent meaning in a universe that does not care whether we exist or not. But here is what makes emotional numbness so insidious, so difficult to address. It protects you from recognizing the problem. Pain announces itself. Depression has weight, has presence, has the dark gravity that demands attention. But numbness? Numbness is absence. It is the lack of signal. It is the psychological equivalent of carbon monoxide poisoning, invisible, odorless, slowly suffocating you while you remain unaware that anything is wrong. You do not realize you cannot feel until someone points out that you should be feeling something. You do not recognize your disconnection until someone makes you aware of the connection you've lost. And even then, even when the recognition arrives, there is often a strange resistance to acknowledging it. Because to acknowledge that you are numb is to acknowledge that something terrible has happened to you, something that required such drastic protection that your psyche had to disconnect from reality itself. The frozen lake wants to remain frozen. Thawing is dangerous. What if beneath the ice there are things you cannot bear to face? The anatomy of dissociation. Now let us examine more closely the mechanism by which consciousness disconnects from itself. Dissociation exists on a spectrum. On the mild end, it includes everyday experiences, driving home and not remembering the route, losing yourself in a book or film, spacing out during a boring meeting. These are normal, adaptive moments of reduced self-awareness. But as we move along the spectrum, dissociation becomes more severe, more pervasive, more detached from conscious control. Depersonalization, the feeling that you are not real, that you are watching yourself from outside, that you are a character in a story rather than the author. You see your hand move, but it does not feel like your hand. You hear your voice speak, but the voice sounds foreign, disconnected. Derealization, the feeling that the world itself is not real, that you are walking through a dream or a simulation. Colors seem muted, sounds seem distant. Nothing has the quality of solid existence. Everything feels flat, two-dimensional, like a stage set rather than authentic reality. And at the far end of the spectrum, dissociative identity disorder, where the psyche fragments into separate identities, each holding different memories, different emotions, different aspects of the unbearable whole. But we are not focusing on the extreme end tonight. We are focusing on the vast middle ground, the millions of people who experience chronic dissociation and emotional numbness without meeting the criteria for a formal disorder. The ones who function, who work, who maintain relationships, who appear normal to the outside world, all while internally experiencing a profound sense of unreality and disconnection. You are there, but you are not there. You are present, but absent. You are alive, but not living. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has spent decades studying the relationship between emotion and consciousness. His research reveals something remarkable. Emotion is not separate from cognition, not separate from reason, not separate from the construction of the conscious self. Rather, emotion is the foundation upon which consciousness itself is built. His theory of somatic markers suggests that every thought, every memory, every decision carries an emotional tag, a bodily felt sense that guides us toward or away from particular options. When this emotional feedback system is damaged or disrupted, Whether through brain injury, trauma, or chronic dissociation, the result is not just an inability to feel, but an impairment in the ability to make decisions, to construct coherent narratives, to maintain a continuous sense of self. In other words, you do not have a self that then experiences emotions. You are a self because you experience emotions, and when emotional experience is numbed, the self itself begins to fragment, to lose coherence, to dissolve into a kind of psychological white noise. This is why numbness feels so existentially threatening. It is not just the absence of pleasant feelings or the avoidance of pain. It is the erosion of the very structure by which you know yourself to exist. The language of the body. But here is where the journey becomes more mysterious, more paradoxical. Even when you cannot feel your emotions consciously, your body is feeling them. The tension in your jaw, the constriction in your chest, the chronic pain in your back, the digestive issues, the headaches, the exhaustion that no amount of sleep relieves. These are not separate problems. They are the voice of emotions that have nowhere else to go. The psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich introduced the concept of body armor, the idea that unprocessed emotions become encoded in muscular tension and chronic holding patterns. The body, unable to express or release emotion through conscious channels, locks it into the tissue itself. More recently, trauma researchers have expanded this understanding. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking work, The Body Keeps the Score, demonstrates that traumatic experiences are stored not primarily in narrative memory, but in implicit somatic memory, in the body's automatic responses, in the nervous system's reactivity, in the very structure of how we hold ourselves in space. So when you say, "I feel nothing," what you really mean is, I feel nothing in the location where I expect to feel feelings, in my chest, in my awareness, in the narrative I tell myself about my inner life. But the feelings are there. They are just in hiding. They are speaking in a language you have forgotten how to hear, the language of sensation, of breath, of movement, of physical presence. This is why talk therapy alone often fails to address deep emotional numbness, because you cannot think your way back into feeling. You cannot reason yourself out of dissociation. The problem is not located in the verbal, analytical mind. It is located in the body, in the nervous system, in the layers of experience that precede language and exceed conscious control. You must return to the body. You must learn to listen to what it has been trying to tell you all along. Consider this invitation. Stop reading for a moment, or rather, let your awareness shift from these words to your direct experience. Can you feel your feet on the floor? Can you sense the weight of your body against the chair or bed? Can you notice your breath moving in and out, whether shallow or deep, fast or slow? For many people experiencing emotional numbness, even these simple acts of embodied awareness are difficult, uncomfortable, or impossible. The connection between consciousness and body has become so tenuous that even noticing physical sensation requires tremendous effort. But this disconnection is not random. It is strategic. It is protective. Because to be fully in your body means to feel what your body is feeling. And if your body is holding years or decades of unprocessed grief, terror, rage, or shame, if beneath the ice there is an ocean of pain, then staying disconnected is the only way to remain functional. The body becomes a foreign country, and you become an exile from your own flesh. The social dimension of shutdown. But we must also understand that emotional numbness is not merely an individual, internal experience. It is profoundly social, relational, interpersonal. Human beings are not isolated consciousness units. We are fundamentally social creatures, and our emotional lives develop in the context of relationships. The infant does not learn to regulate emotion alone. They learn through the attuned responses of caregivers. The child does not develop a sense of self in isolation. They develop it through the mirror of how others see them, respond to them, value them. What happens then when the social environment itself is emotionally numb? The psychologist Edward Tronick conducted a famous experiment called the still face paradigm. A mother plays normally with her infant, responsive and engaged. Then, at the researcher's signal, she makes her face completely neutral. No expression, no response, no emotional feedback, just blank presence. The infant's reaction is immediate and disturbing. They try to re-engage the mother, smiling, reaching, vocalizing. When this fails, they escalate, crying, distress signals. And finally, after repeated failure to elicit response, they shut down. They look away. They go emotionally flat. In just a few minutes of non-responsiveness, the infant learns the pattern that will haunt some of them for life. Emotional expression is futile. Connection is unavailable. The only safe state is shutdown. Now expand this dynamic across an entire childhood, across an entire society. What happens when we live in a culture where emotional vulnerability is viewed as weakness? Where men are taught to suppress everything except anger? Where women are socialized to prioritize others' emotions over their own? Where success is defined by performance rather than authenticity? We create a collective frozen lake. We normalize disconnection. We pathologize the very sensitivity and emotional aliveness that makes us human. The philosopher Martin Buber distinguished between two modes of relating, I-it and I-thou. In I-it relationships, the other person is experienced as an object, a function, a role, a means to an end. In I-thou relationships, the other person is experienced as a full subject, a consciousness, a being, a mystery worthy of genuine encounter. Emotional numbness, in this framework, is what happens when our relationships become predominantly I-it. When we interact with others as roles rather than persons. When even our most intimate connections become transactional, performative, devoid of genuine presence. And here is the feedback loop. The more numb you become, the more your relationships feel empty. The more your relationships feel empty, the more numb you become. Until connection itself seems like a distant memory, a capacity you once had, but have somehow lost. You are surrounded by people, and you are utterly alone. The spiritual crisis of meaninglessness. But perhaps the deepest dimension of emotional numbness is spiritual, not in the sense of religion necessarily, but in the sense of our fundamental orientation toward existence, toward meaning, toward the question of why anything matters at all. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, observed that humans can endure almost any suffering if they have a sense of meaning. But take away meaning, leave someone in a situation where their suffering seems pointless, their existence irrelevant, and psychological collapse quickly follows. He called this existential vacuum, the experience of inner emptiness, of life without purpose or direction or significance. And emotional numbness, I would suggest, is one manifestation of this vacuum. When nothing matters, why would you feel anything about it? When existence itself seems arbitrary and meaningless, why would you invest emotional energy in any of it? This is not philosophical abstraction. This is lived reality for countless people in the modern world. You work a job that feels meaningless. You scroll through social media that leaves you feeling empty. You engage in relationships that lack depth or authenticity. You pursue pleasures that provide temporary distraction but no lasting satisfaction. You look at the state of the world, the injustice, the suffering, the climate crisis, the political chaos, and you feel overwhelmed, helpless, irrelevant. And so, slowly, imperceptibly, you begin to shut down, not as a conscious choice, but as a natural response to a world that seems to offer no genuine nourishment for the soul. The theologian Paul Tillich wrote about the courage to be, the fundamental act of affirming one's existence in the face of non-being, meaninglessness, and death. He suggested that anxiety is the price we pay for consciousness, for freedom, for the terrible knowledge that we exist temporarily in a universe that will continue without us. Emotional numbness, then, might be understood as the failure of this courage, the moment when the anxiety becomes too great, when the groundlessness of existence becomes unbearable, when consciousness says, I cannot bear to keep feeling this. I cannot sustain the intensity of being fully present to a reality this uncertain, this painful, this devoid of guarantees. And so the lights go out, the emotional landscape goes dark, and you continue to exist, but in a diminished form, alive, but not fully living. The technology of distraction. We must also confront the role of technology in facilitating and deepening emotional numbness. The smartphone in your pocket is the most sophisticated attention capture device ever created. Its algorithms are designed by teams of engineers and psychologists whose explicit goal is to maximize engagement, which means minimizing your ability to be present, reflective, or internally focused. Every notification is a disruption. Every scroll is a microdose of novelty. Every like is a tiny hit of validation that keeps you checking, refreshing, returning for more. And in this constant state of distracted partial attention, genuine feeling becomes impossible, because emotion requires presence. It requires sustained focus. It requires the willingness to stay with an experience long enough to fully register it. But the technology trains you otherwise. It trains you to skim, to scan, to move on before any experience can deepen into feeling. It creates a mode of consciousness that is perpetually surfing, never diving. The result? A generation of people who describe themselves as numb, detached, unable to concentrate, constantly restless but never satisfied. This is not accident. This is design. Your attention is the product being sold, and the more fragmented, distracted, and emotionally shallow you become, the more effectively that product can be monetized. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek points out that ideology today functions not through direct oppression, but through the endless provision of pleasurable distractions. We are not prevented from resisting. We are simply given so many entertaining alternatives that resistance never becomes necessary. Emotional numbness, in this light, is a political condition as much as a psychological one. It is the psychic state most conducive to maintaining the status quo, a population that feels nothing strongly enough to demand change, that is too exhausted and disconnected to organize resistance, that has been trained to seek individual solutions, therapy, meditation, self-help, to problems that are fundamentally collective and structural. You are numb not just because of your personal trauma. You are numb because numbness serves the system that profits from your disengagement, the breaking point. And yet, despite all these forces, the neurobiology, the trauma, the social conditioning, the technological manipulation, the existential vacuum, there comes a moment for some people when the numbness becomes unbearable in a different way. Not unbearable because it hurts. Numbness, by definition, doesn't hurt. Unbearable because the absence itself becomes a presence. Because the frozen lake, maintained year after year, becomes its own form of suffering. Because you realize that in protecting yourself from pain, you have also cut yourself off from joy, from love, from meaning, from the very experiences that make being human worthwhile. This is the crisis point. This is the descent into the frozen depths where the real work must begin. Because you cannot thaw from the surface. You cannot simply decide to feel again and have it be so. The ice is too thick, the protection too complete, the neural pathways of shutdown too well established. No, the thawing must happen from below, from the depths where the original freezing occurred, from the wound that was too great to feel, the pain that was too overwhelming to process, the truth about yourself or your life that was too devastating to acknowledge. And this is terrifying, because what if beneath the ice there is not just pain, but annihilation? What if the reason you went numb was because feeling would literally destroy you? What if the frozen lake is not a prison, but the only thing preventing total psychological collapse? These are not irrational fears. The psyche is wise, the protection mechanisms developed for good reasons. The numbness saved you once. But here is the paradox you must ultimately face. The protection that saved you is now suffocating you. The defense that preserved your sanity is now preventing your growth. The frozen lake that offered refuge has become a tomb, and the only way out is through, The only way to thaw is to feel. The only way to reclaim your life is to risk everything you've built to survive without one. The courage to feel. Let us begin with a fundamental truth that no one wants to hear, but everyone must eventually face. You cannot heal from emotional numbness by thinking about it. You cannot analyze your way back into feeling. You cannot understand the mechanisms of dissociation intellectually and expect that understanding alone to restore your emotional life. Knowledge is not transformation. Insight is not integration. The path back to feeling requires something far more difficult, far more courageous. You must be willing to feel everything you have been avoiding. The Jungian analyst Marion Woodman spoke of the necessity of going into the wound. She argued that healing does not happen by stepping around our pain, by managing it from a safe distance, by developing sophisticated strategies to keep it contained. Healing happens by entering the pain fully, by allowing ourselves to be transformed by the very thing we most fear. This is not masochism. This is not glorifying suffering. This is recognizing that the pain you refuse to feel does not disappear. It simply operates outside conscious awareness, shaping your life in ways you cannot see or control. The frozen lake must crack, and that cracking begins with the willingness to feel even a single moment of authentic emotion. However small, however brief, however uncomfortable. Perhaps it is a moment of grief that you allow yourself to notice rather than immediately distract from. Perhaps it is anger that you let simmer rather than immediately suppress. Perhaps it is vulnerability that you risk expressing to another person, even though every fiber of your being wants to retreat into familiar numbness. These moments are terrifying, because they prove that beneath the ice you are still alive, and if you are still alive, you can still be hurt. The body as portal. But here is the secret that trauma therapy has discovered over the past few decades. The fastest route back to feeling is through the body, not through the mind. Somatic therapies, approaches like somatic experiencing, sensorimotor psychotherapy, and trauma-informed yoga work directly with the body's stored experience of emotion. They recognize that you cannot talk about what you don't have words for, but you can feel what has been locked in tissue, in posture, in breath. Consider a simple experiment. Clench your fists as tightly as you can. Hold the tension. Notice what happens in your arms, your shoulders, your jaw. Notice how the tension spreads, how the body contracts around this single point of holding. This is what you have been doing emotionally, often without realizing it. Clenching, bracing, armoring yourself against feeling. And just as physical tension can be released through awareness and gentle movement, emotional numbness can be addressed through embodied practices that create safety for feeling to return. The breath is often the first access point. When we are numb, our breathing becomes shallow, restricted, held. We breathe just enough to survive, but not enough to feel fully alive. By bringing attention to the breath, by allowing it to deepen, to move through the body, to expand the spaces that have been contracted, we begin to thaw the frozen places. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, breath by breath, sensation by sensation. The trauma researcher Peter Levine, founder of Somatic Experiencing, discovered that animals in the wild, after escaping a predator, go through a physical discharge process, shaking, trembling, literally shaking off the stress response. But humans, with our complex nervous systems and our capacity for thought, often interrupt this natural completion. We tell ourselves to calm down, to get it together, to stop being so dramatic. And in doing so, we trap the incomplete stress response in the body, where it remains, sometimes for years or decades, contributing to chronic numbness and dissociation. The path back to feeling, then, involves allowing the body to complete what it started, to discharge the stored activation, to process the interrupted responses, to literally shake off the protective freeze that has held you captive. This is not comfortable work. Your body might shake. You might cry without knowing why. You might experience waves of heat or cold, of nausea or dizziness as the nervous system recalibrates. These are not signs that something is wrong. They are signs that something is finally becoming right. The frozen lake is cracking. The thaw has begun. The relational crucible. But here is what makes this process most challenging and most essential. You cannot fully thaw alone. Emotional numbness developed in the context of relationships that were unsafe, unavailable, or overwhelming. And the healing of emotional numbness requires relationships that are safe, attuned, and capable of holding your experience without judgment or abandonment. This is the function of therapy at its best, not as a place to analyze problems, but as a relational field where it becomes safe to feel again, where another consciousness holds space for your experience without trying to fix it, explain it away, or rush you through it. The therapist who can tolerate your numbness without needing you to be different. The friend who can sit with your silence without filling it with empty reassurance. The partner who can witness your thawing without being overwhelmed by what emerges. These relationships are the crucible in which transformation happens. But they require something from you that may feel impossible. Vulnerability. The willingness to let another person see you in your numbness, in your confusion, in your raw, undefended emergence back into feeling. The neuroscience of connection reveals why this is so powerful. Mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing it, allow us to literally feel into another person's experience. When you are with someone who can feel when you cannot, their capacity for emotion can begin to reactivate your own dormant circuits. This is not metaphor. This is biology. This is how infants learn to regulate emotion, by borrowing the nervous system of attuned caregivers. And this is how adults recover emotional capacity after trauma, by experiencing co-regulation with others who can feel what they cannot yet access. You learn to feel by being felt. You learn to connect by being connected to. You learn to be present by experiencing another's presence. The integration of shadow. Now, we must return to Jung's concept of the shadow, all those aspects of ourselves we have rejected, denied, or refused to acknowledge. The shadow is not just our dark side. It is everything we decided was too dangerous, too unacceptable, too threatening to our self-image to be integrated into conscious awareness. And for many people experiencing emotional numbness, the shadow contains not just rage and desire, but also grief, joy, vulnerability, and need. You became numb not just to avoid pain, but to avoid all feeling. Because in your early environment, even positive emotions were unsafe. Joy made you a target for resentment. Excitement was punished as too much. Vulnerability invited exploitation, and so everything got frozen. Not just the uncomfortable feelings, but all feeling. The process of awakening, then, requires a difficult recognition. The person you have been, the functional, controlled, emotionally regulated person, is not your true self. It is a construction, a protective identity, what Jung called the persona. Beneath this persona, in the frozen depths, your authentic self waits, messy, contradictory, fully alive, and reclaiming that authentic self requires what Jung called individuation, the process of integrating the shadow, of making conscious what has been unconscious, of becoming whole rather than merely acceptable. This is the real work of awakening from emotional numbness, not just feeling again, but discovering who you actually are when you're not performing safety, when you're not protecting others from your reality, when you're not managing your presentation for external approval. Who are you when you let yourself feel everything? Who emerges when the ice finally cracks? The alchemical transformation. The medieval alchemists, in their mysterious symbolic language, described a process they called nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the necessary death that precedes transformation. They understood that you cannot transform lead into gold without first breaking down the lead entirely, reducing it to base matter, allowing the old structure to collapse. Emotional numbness is your nigredo. It is the dissolution of the false self, the ego death that precedes rebirth, the necessary collapse that creates space for something new to emerge. But this reframing requires a radical shift in perspective. You must stop viewing your numbness as a failure, a pathology, a problem to be fixed. Instead, you must recognize it as a sacred process, a death that is making way for resurrection. This does not mean romanticizing suffering. It does not mean pretending that numbness is pleasant or desirable. It means understanding that in the larger arc of psychological development, the capacity to shut down completely is the foundation for the capacity to open completely. You had to learn to freeze before you could learn to thaw. You had to experience total protection before you could risk total vulnerability. You had to lose yourself before you could discover who you truly are. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks of groundlessness as not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. The recognition that there is no permanent, solid ground beneath our feet, no ultimate security, no final certainty. The anxiety and numbness we experience often arise from our desperate attempts to find solid ground in a fundamentally groundless existence. What if the thawing of emotional numbness requires accepting this groundlessness? What if feeling fully alive means surrendering the illusion of control, of certainty, of being able to protect yourself from all pain? What if the frozen lake is your last desperate attempt to stand on solid ground in a universe that offers none? And what if awakening means stepping onto thin ice, allowing it to crack, allowing yourself to fall through into the cold water below, and discovering that you can swim? The wisdom beyond words. As feeling begins to return, as the thaw progresses, you will discover something strange and powerful. There are layers of experience that have no words, no concepts, no way to be captured in language. This is what the mystics have always known, that the deepest truths are not communicated through explanation, but through direct experience, that there is a mode of knowing that precedes and exceeds verbal understanding. When you begin to feel again after years of numbness, you are not just experiencing emotions. You are encountering raw consciousness itself, the felt sense of being alive, of being embodied, of being connected to the vast web of existence. This cannot be described. It can only be lived. And this is why the journey through emotional numbness is ultimately a spiritual journey, not just a psychological one. Because on the other side of numbness is not just the restoration of emotion, but the discovery of a way of being that is more present, more awake, more real than anything you've known before. The philosopher Martin Heidegger distinguished between existing and truly being. Most people, he suggested, live in a state of inauthenticity, going through the motions, conforming to social expectations, never encountering their own genuine existence. Emotional numbness is the extreme form of this inauthenticity, and awakening from numbness is the movement toward authentic being, the collective awakening. But let us zoom out now from the individual journey to the collective transformation. What if the epidemic of emotional numbness in our time is not just individual pathology, but a sign that something is trying to emerge? What if millions of people simultaneously experiencing disconnection and dissociation is consciousness itself trying to break through to a new level? The philosopher John Gebser proposed that human consciousness evolves through distinct structures, from the archaic to the magic, to the mythical to the mental, and that we are currently in the midst of a transition to what he called the integral structure of consciousness. This transition, he suggested, is characterized by the breakdown of old forms, by widespread anxiety and disorientation, by a sense that the familiar ways of making meaning no longer work. Emotional numbness, in this view, is a symptom of this transition. It is what happens when the old structures of consciousness, the mental, rational mode that has dominated Western civilization for centuries, can no longer contain or process the complexity of contemporary existence. We are being forced to evolve, and evolution is never comfortable. The social theorist Charles Eisenstein speaks of the space between stories, the collective experience of living in a time when the old story, endless growth, material progress, individual success, has lost its power to inspire, while the new story, Ecological wisdom, collective well-being, spiritual depth has not yet fully emerged. We are in the space between stories, and that space feels like numbness, like the absence of meaning, of direction, of solid ground. But what if this absence is actually a clearing? What if the stripping away of old meanings is creating space for new meanings to emerge? What if your personal journey through numbness is part of a larger collective awakening? The technology of consciousness. And here is where we must confront the most speculative, most future-oriented dimension of our exploration: the role of technology in either deepening or healing emotional numbness. On one hand, as we've discussed, digital technology has contributed significantly to the epidemic of disconnection and dissociation. The attention economy, social media, the algorithmic curation of reality, all these have trained us in fragmentation, in superficiality, in the avoidance of deep feeling. But there is another possibility emerging: the use of technology to facilitate consciousness transformation. Neurofeedback allows people to observe their own brain states in real time and learn to shift them consciously. Virtual reality is being used in trauma therapy to create safe environments for exposure and processing. Psychedelic research is revealing how substances like psilocybin and MDMA can temporarily dissolve the ego defenses that maintain numbness, allowing for deep emotional processing and integration. And beyond these specific technologies, there is the larger question of artificial intelligence and its potential impact on consciousness. As AI systems become more sophisticated, as they begin to mirror and perhaps even enhance our cognitive capacities, what will happen to human consciousness? Some fear that AI will deepen our alienation, that we will become even more disconnected from our embodied emotional humanity. But others envision a future where AI serves as a mirror for consciousness itself, helping us understand our own minds more deeply, reflecting back to us the patterns and processes we cannot see directly, perhaps even facilitating the kind of self-awareness that is necessary for transformation. What if the technology that helped create the problem also becomes part of the solution? What if the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of technology are not separate processes, but interwoven destinies? But let us not get lost in speculation. Let us return to the present moment, to your present experience, to the immediate question: what do you do now? The daily practice of thawing. Because ultimately, the awakening from emotional numbness is not a single dramatic moment of transformation. It is a daily practice, a constant choosing, a gradual thawing that happens through small, repeated actions. It is noticing when you're beginning to go numb and pausing rather than completing the shutdown. It is feeling into the physical sensations in your body rather than immediately dissociating from them. It is staying with discomfort for just 5 more seconds than usual. It is risking one moment of authentic expression when your habitual pattern would be to hide. The practices are simple but not easy. Breathe deeply and consciously several times a day. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice 3 sensory details in your environment. Place your hand on your heart and acknowledge whatever feeling is present, even if that feeling is absence. Move your body in ways that invite aliveness, not performative exercise, but authentic movement that expresses something internal. Dance, shake, stretch. Allow your body to speak its own language. Engage in practices that invite presence, meditation, yoga, spending time in nature, creating art, playing music, anything that requires sustained attention and invites you into the felt sense of the present moment. But perhaps most importantly, connect with others authentically. Share your experience of numbness with someone safe. Let yourself be seen in your struggle. Risk vulnerability even when, especially when, it feels impossible. Because here is the ultimate truth about emotional numbness. It is maintained by isolation. It thrives in secrecy. It deepens when you believe you are alone in your experience. The moment you speak your numbness aloud to another person who truly hears you, the ice begins to crack. The gift in the wound. And now, as we approach the culmination of this journey, Let us address the most mysterious, most paradoxical aspect of emotional numbness. What if it is not just a wound, but also a gift? What if the capacity to go numb, to disconnect from overwhelming feeling, has given you something valuable, something you might not want to lose even as you move toward healing? The people who have experienced deep emotional numbness often develop extraordinary capacities. The ability to remain calm in crisis, to think clearly when others panic, to endure difficult circumstances that would break someone whose emotional vulnerability was never tested. You have learned to survive. You have developed a kind of psychological strength that cannot be taught through comfort or ease, and even more mysteriously, the journey through numbness has given you direct knowledge of consciousness itself. You have experienced the malleability of the self, the constructed nature of emotion, the way awareness can disconnect from experience. You have lived proof that what seems solid and permanent is actually fluid and contingent. This knowledge, terrible as it was to acquire, is also profound wisdom. You know something that most people never learn, that consciousness is not a fixed thing, that the self is not a solid entity, that reality itself shifts depending on the state of awareness we bring to it. This is the same knowledge that mystics and meditation masters spend lifetimes trying to cultivate. You received it through suffering, yes, but you received it nonetheless. And so the question is not, how do I erase my experience of numbness and return to some imagined state of innocent feeling? The question is, how do I integrate this knowledge, this capacity, this hard-won wisdom into a life that is both fully feeling and deeply wise? How do I remain open to emotion while retaining the ability to create distance when necessary? How do I feel everything without being overwhelmed by anything? How do I live with vulnerability and strength simultaneously? These are not questions with simple answers. They are the questions of mastery, the lifelong practice of balancing opposites, holding paradox, becoming fully human. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, or rather, at the recognition that there is no end, only continuous transformation, continuous awakening, continuous cycles of freezing and thawing as consciousness spirals through its evolutionary development. Let us gather the threads of everything we have explored. We began at the evolutionary origins of shutdown, understanding that the capacity for numbness is encoded in the most ancient parts of our nervous system, a survival mechanism that served us when the threat was a predator, but becomes problematic when the threat is existence itself. We descended into the neurological and psychological mechanisms of dissociation, tracing how trauma, overwhelm, and modern existence itself can lead to the protective disconnection of consciousness from felt experience. We explored the social and existential dimensions of numbness, how it arises not just from individual wounds, but from collective conditions, from a culture that increasingly demands performance over presence, productivity over peace, constant stimulation over deep reflection. And finally, we turned toward awakening, understanding that the path out of numbness is not a simple restoration of feeling, but a profound transformation of consciousness itself. A journey that requires courage, patience, embodied practice, authentic relationship, and the willingness to integrate shadow, to embrace groundlessness, to become who you truly are rather than who you learn to be. The frozen lake is not your enemy. It never was. It was your protection, your refuge, your wise organism doing exactly what it needed to do to preserve some essential spark of life when life became too dangerous to fully inhabit. But the protection has done its work. The immediate threat has passed, or at least transformed into something you can now face with greater resources, with adult consciousness, with support and understanding that weren't available when the freeze first occurred. And now, the frozen lake waits for your decision. Will you remain on its surface, safe but separate, protected but not truly living? Or will you allow the thaw? Will you risk the crack? Will you step onto thin ice knowing it might break? Knowing you might fall, knowing that beneath the protective surface lies the cold water of full feeling, but also the possibility of swimming, of moving, of being truly alive? This is not a decision you make once. This is a decision you make every day, every hour, every moment, when you feel the familiar numbness beginning to descend and you choose, just for this one breath, just for this one moment, to feel instead. The ancient alchemists had a phrase, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. They understood that transformation requires both the breaking down of old structures and the conscious forming of new ones. You must dissolve the frozen identity, the protective self, the armor of numbness, and then consciously construct a new way of being that is more flexible, more authentic, more aligned with the truth of who you are. This is the work of a lifetime. This is the great task of becoming human in the fullest sense. And you are not alone in it. Even in your numbness, even in your isolation, you are part of a larger collective process. Millions of others are walking through this same territory, thawing their own frozen lakes, discovering their own capacity for authentic feeling and authentic being. We are witnessing, perhaps, the birth pangs of a new form of human consciousness, one that has moved through disconnection and learned to reconnect, one that has experienced the breakdown of meaning and is discovering new sources of meaning, one that has touched the void and returned with wisdom about the nature of existence itself. Your numbness is part of this larger story. Your awakening contributes to this collective transformation. And here is the ultimate paradox, the deepest truth that I can offer you as we conclude this journey. The opposite of emotional numbness is not constant feeling. It is not being overwhelmed by emotion every moment. It is not losing the capacity for calm, for distance, for perspective. The opposite of numbness is choice. It is the capacity to feel when feeling is appropriate and to create distance when distance is necessary. It is the flexibility to move between engagement and detachment, between vulnerability and protection, between opening and closing, not as automatic responses to threat, but as conscious choices made by an aware consciousness. This is freedom. This is mastery. This is what you are becoming through this difficult passage. The person who has never been numb cannot understand this freedom. They feel automatically, reactively, without awareness of the complex mechanisms by which consciousness constructs emotional experience. But you, having lost the capacity to feel, and then consciously reclaimed it, you understand something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. You understand that you are not your emotions. You are the awareness that experiences emotions. You are not your numbness. You are the consciousness that observes numbness. You are not your body, your thoughts, your identity. You are the vast, spacious awareness within which all these phenomena arise and dissolve. This is not dissociation. This is awakening. This is not detachment. This is wisdom. So as you move forward from this moment, carry with you this understanding. The frozen lake will call to you again. There will be moments when the old protection seems safer, easier, more familiar than the uncertain territory of full aliveness. And in those moments you will choose. Choose wisely. Choose consciously. Choose with awareness of what you are gaining and what you are sacrificing with each choice. And know that the capacity for numbness that once felt like a curse is also a profound gift. It means you possess the full range of consciousness, from the most shut down to the most open, from the most defended to the most vulnerable. You contain multitudes. You are not broken. You are becoming. The ancients understood something we are only now rediscovering, that consciousness is not a fixed state, but an ongoing process, that the self is not a thing but a becoming, that what we call I is actually a verb disguised as a noun. You are not a frozen lake. You are the water, capable of freezing, of thawing, of flowing, of transforming with each season of existence. And this moment right now is your spring. The ice is cracking. The first drops of meltwater are beginning to move. Can you feel it? Welcome back to the land of the living. Welcome back to the full catastrophe of feeling. Welcome back to yourself. The journey continues. For those seeking to explore deeper, The awakening from emotional numbness is not a destination, but a practice, not a solution, but a path. Walk it with patience, with compassion for yourself, with trust in the wisdom of your own consciousness. The frozen lake taught you survival. Now let the thawing teach you how to truly live.